The courtroom went silent when she walked through the door. Not the silence of an empty room. The charged silence of a room full of people who have just seen something they were not expecting and have not yet decided what to do with it. She was 27 years old and she was carrying an evidence folder, and she walked like someone who had not slept in 31 hours and was not going to let that be visible. Navy suit. Hair up. The particular composure of a person who has been preparing for this moment for 3 years and has finally arrived at it and is not going to waste it by looking like she has. The man in handcuffs at the front of the room turned when he heard the door. He had not cried in front of another person in 40 years. He cried now. She said, "Dad. I'm here." He said nothing. He could not. She walked to the defense table and set the folder down and looked at the judge and said, "My name is Mara Shin. I am a licensed attorney admitted to this court. I am requesting to join the defense." The prosecutor stood up. The judge raised a hand. The room held its breath. "Before we begin, if you believe that the greatest debts are the ones we repay not with money but with everything we have learned and everything we have become, please like this video, subscribe to Kindness Tales, and share this story with someone who needs to believe in loyalty today." His name was Sung-Jin Yoon. He was 64 years old and he had spent the first half of his life building something the law called a criminal organization and the second half of his life quietly becoming something else, which is a journey the law does not have a clean category for and which the prosecution in this courtroom had chosen to ignore entirely in favor of the first half. He had been many things. He had been feared. He had been powerful in the way that certain men become powerful in cities that have shadows, the kind of power that does not appear in newspapers until it disappears from the streets and people realize it was the thing holding certain worse things back. He had been ruthless in his earlier years in ways he did not defend and had spent 20 years making quieter amends for in ways that also did not appear in newspapers. He had been, for 15 years, a father. Not by blood. By choice. Which is the harder kind and the more permanent one. He had found her when she was 12 years old. Her name had been Mara then too, Mara without a last name because last names require a family and she had not had one for 3 years, since her parents had died in a fire in the building where they rented 2 rooms, and she had survived by being at a neighbor's apartment and had spent the following 3 years in a series of placements that had not held and on streets that had. She was 12 years old and she was sleeping in the covered entrance of a building that belonged to Sung-Jin's organization when one of his men found her and brought her inside, not because the organization had a policy about such things but because the man who found her had a daughter at home and something in him would not allow the alternative. Sung-Jin had come down to deal with the situation personally. He had looked at her. She had looked at him without flinching. He had said, "How long have you been here?" She had said, 4 nights. He had said, "Where are your parents?" She had said, "They died 3 years ago." He had said, "Where have you been since then?" She had told him. Simply. Without performance. The way she told everything, as a series of facts that had happened and that she had survived and that she was reporting accurately because accuracy was the only control she had over a story that had happened to her without her consent. He had stood in the entrance of his building and listened to a 12-year-old describe 3 years of surviving alone and had felt something shift in him that he had thought was no longer capable of shifting. He had said, "You can come inside." She had said, "For how long?" He had said, "For as long as you need." She had said, "I will not be a burden." He had said, "I did not say you would be." She had looked at him for a long time with the assessment of a child who has learned to read adults very quickly because reading them incorrectly has consequences. She had come inside. A kindness tale. Before we continue, Kindness Tales wants you to know what the next 15 years actually looked like. Because the story that reached the courtroom that morning was a story about a criminal organization and a legal defense and a daughter who had become a lawyer. But underneath that story was something quieter and more important. Sung-Jin had not known how to be a father. He had known how to be many other things, but fatherhood was not in his previous inventory, and he had approached it the way he approached everything he did not know, which was with the complete, unhurried willingness to be wrong repeatedly until he was less wrong. He had enrolled her in school the week she arrived. She had been behind in some things and ahead in others, and the teacher at the first school had sent a note home in the third week saying Mara was exceptionally capable, and was anyone aware of that? Sung Jin had read the note 3 times. He had hired a tutor. Then 2 tutors. He had sat at the kitchen table on evenings when his schedule allowed and asked her what she was studying, and listened when she explained it with the focused attention of someone who respected what was being said and the person saying it. She had been suspicious of the attention for the first year. Then gradually less suspicious. Then, in the way that children allow themselves to trust when the evidence accumulates past a certain threshold, not suspicious at all. She had called him a byoji for the first time on a Tuesday evening in her second year when she was 13, and it had slipped out naturally in the middle of a sentence about her homework, and they had both heard it and neither of them acknowledged it, and she had continued the sentence and he had continued listening, and after she went to bed he had sat at the kitchen table for a long time. There was a housekeeper named Mrs. Park who had worked in the house for many years before Mara arrived, and who had quietly, without direction, begun doing the things that Mara needed someone to do. She braided her hair when Mara could not manage the back herself. She taught her to make kimchi because Mara had asked. She attended the school performance when Sung Jin had an unavoidable conflict and had taken photographs and described every moment in detail so he could hear it. She had bought the first proper winter coat because she had noticed in October that Mara was layering sweaters, and had not said anything because saying anything would have made Mara feel noticed in the wrong way. Mrs. Park understood the difference. There was a man in the organization named Dae-hoon who had been with Sung Jin for 20 years and who had appointed himself, informally and without asking, as something in the direction of an older brother. He drove Mara to school when schedules required it and argued with her about music and took her side without exception in any disagreement she had with the household because he had decided this was his position and was consistent about it. Mara had said once that Dae-hoon was the most reliably partisan person she had ever met. He had said, "That is my job." She had said, "It is not your job." He had said, "It is the job I decided to have." These were the people who raised her alongside Sung Jin. Not a conventional family. Not a documented one. But a real one in the ways that matter, in consistency and presence and the specific quality of people who show up without being asked. Mara had become a lawyer because at 15 she had watched a situation unfold in proximity to the household that had shown her what happened when power was applied without accountability, and had decided that the counter to that was knowledge, and that the most useful knowledge was the law. She had told Sung Jin this with the directness that had been characteristic of her since she was 12. He had said, "Then study the law." She had said, "It will cost." He had said, "I am aware of what things cost. Study the law." She had studied the law. She had graduated top of her class. She had clerked for 2 years. She had worked for 3 years at a firm that did not know her history, and had discovered in those 3 years that she was exceptionally good at evidence and at the construction of an argument and at the particular skill of finding the thing in a case that everyone else was looking past. She had been building toward this courtroom for 3 years without telling Sung Jin. Not because she was hiding it from him. Because she wanted to arrive when it mattered and not before. She had arrived. The judge reviewed her credentials. The prosecutor objected. The judge overruled the objection on procedural grounds and noted that the credentials were in order and the defendant had the right to counsel of his choice. Mara sat down. She opened the evidence folder. She looked at the lead prosecutor, a man named Whitmore who had been building this case for 2 years and who looked at her with the expression of someone who has just recalculated a situation and does not yet know what the new calculation produces. The case against Sung Jin had been constructed around financial records spanning 14 years that the prosecution claimed documented the ongoing operation of a criminal enterprise. The records were real. The interpretation was the question. What the prosecution had not accounted for was that Mara had spent 3 years obtaining, through entirely legal channels, a parallel set of records that told a different story about the same 14 years. Not a fabricated story. The true one. The one about what the money had actually become. The clinics in 2 neighborhoods that bore no connection in any public record to Sung Jin's name. The educational fund that had sent 43 children from 3 specific blocks to university over 12 years. The quiet retirement arrangements made for 11 families whose breadwinners had been lost to violence that Sung Jin had spent years working to reduce. None of it documented. All of it traceable to someone who knew where to look and had looked. She had looked. She presented the evidence over 2 days. The courtroom changed as she presented it. Not dramatically. In the slow, incremental way that rooms change when the picture they were given at the beginning turns out to be missing significant portions and the missing portions are being filled in one document at a time. On the second afternoon she made the closing argument. She said, "The prosecution has shown you what this man was. I have shown you what he became. I have shown you the evidence of a man who used what he had built to do things the law cannot compel anyone to do and that no one with his resources was required to do. I am not asking you to ignore what he was. I am asking you to see all of what he is. Because the law is not supposed to be a photograph taken at the worst moment. It is supposed to be an account of the whole truth. I have brought you the whole truth." She set down her notes. She said, "My name is Mara Shin. I was 12 years old and I was sleeping in a doorway when this man brought me inside and told me I could stay as long as I needed. He did not know me. I was not useful to him. I was a child on a pavement and he made a decision and that decision became my life. Everything I am standing here with, this education, this argument, this evidence, exists because of that decision. I am not telling you this to make you sympathize with him. I am telling you this because you asked who he is. That is who he is. A man who made that decision and then spent 15 years living up to it. That is the whole of my testimony." She sat down. The room was quiet for a long moment. Sung Jin was looking at the table in front of him. Mara did not look at the verdict when it came. She looked at him. He was acquitted on the primary charges. 2 lesser findings remained and would require resolution. But the empire was not gone. The name was not destroyed. The 15 years were not erased. Outside the courthouse the cameras were waiting. Sung Jin stood on the steps for a moment in the afternoon light with his daughter beside him and said nothing to the cameras because he had never said anything to cameras and was not going to begin today. He looked at Mara. He said, 3 years. She said, "I wanted to be ready." He said, "You were ready at 20. She said, "I needed more evidence." He looked at her. He said, "I have not known what to do with what you are since you were 12 years old." She said, "You figured it out." He said, "I made many mistakes." She said, "You showed up every time. That covers a lot of mistakes." He said, "Your parents." She said, "I know." He said, "I was not them." She said, "No. You were something else. Something I did not have a name for at first. I have one now." He said, "What is it?" She said, "Home." He looked at the city below the courthouse steps. The city he had spent 40 years navigating and the last 20 trying to partially redeem. The city that had a girl asleep in a doorway on a specific night 20 years ago and would never know what that night had set in motion. Daehoon was at the bottom of the steps. He gave a nod in Mara's direction that meant what it always meant, which was, "I told everyone you would do it." Mrs. Park was there too, smaller than she used to be, with her phone already out because she was going to take a photograph and describe every moment to whoever needed to hear it. Mara went down the steps. She shook hands with the attorneys. She answered 2 questions from a journalist briefly and accurately and said nothing more than was true. She made a call she had been holding for 3 years to a woman who had supervised her clerk year and who had told her once, offhandedly, that she would be one of the best if she let herself be, and said it had happened. The woman had said, "I know. I watched the live feed." Mara had laughed. Real laugh. Full one. The one that meant something had finished and something else was beginning, and she was ready for both. That evening she sat at the kitchen table in the house where she had come inside from the cold at 12 years old and eaten her first hot meal in 3 days, and looked at a man across the table who had not known what to do with her and had done everything anyway. They ate together. Mrs. Park had made the meal. Dae-hoon had shown up uninvited. The table was full in the way it had been full on all the evenings that had built toward this one without any of them knowing it at the time. Sung-jin said, "What happens now?" Mara said, "You have remaining proceedings. I will handle them." He said, "And after?" She said, "I have been offered a position at a firm that specializes in wrongful prosecution cases." He said, "You will take it." She said, "I was going to ask your opinion first." He looked at her. He said, "You have never asked my opinion on your career." She said, "I am starting now." He said, "Take it. You will be extraordinary at it." She said, "That is your opinion." He said, "It has always been my opinion. From the first week when the school sent the note home." She said, "You kept that note." He said, "I keep everything you have done." She looked at her hands. She said, "I know. She had found the drawer once, years ago. The report cards. The program from the school performance Mrs. Park had attended. The graduation photograph. The newspaper from the day she passed the bar. Every note. Every piece of evidence of who she had become. Kept by a man who had found a child in a doorway and made one decision and had spent 15 years being the person that decision required him to be. She said, "Thank you." He said, "For what specifically?" She said, "For opening the door." He said, "You would have found another door." She said, "Maybe. But you opened this one." They finished dinner. Dae-hoon argued with Mara about something minor and took her side before she finished making her case, which was his consistent position and always would be. Mrs. Park cleared the table and hummed something to herself in the kitchen. Outside the city continued. Inside the table was full. The door that had opened 15 years ago was still open. It had never once been closed. If this story stayed with you, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to believe in loyalty and second chances today. Subscribe to Kindness Tales for more stories of unexpected family, quiet courage, and the decisions that change everything. Because sometimes home is not where you started. It is the door someone opened when they did not have to. And everything that was built on the other side of it. Welcome to Kindness Tales. We are so glad you are here.